Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Dirty Delights podcast. Today we have Lucy Jones, who is a journalist, author, and owner of one of the most wholesome Twitter pages I've ever seen. Her most recent book, Losing Eden: Why Our Minds Need the Wild, is a memoir packed with research detailing her recovery from addiction with the help of nature. Lucy, thanks for doing this.
Pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to this. First and foremost, what is the crack?
The crack's good. Yeah, I was feeling a little bit irritable this morning, and then we went for a walk, me and my family, in the woods for an hour or so, and I feel completely different. And I feel really quite fine.
I notice every time that I go for a walk around some trees, it's almost like I feel lighter afterwards. And yeah, I guess we can talk about this a bit more in detail as the podcast goes on. But
Yeah, we'll get into it. It's very restorative.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How about
Um,
you? What's the crack with you?
the crack is good here. Thanks for asking. Yeah, I feel quite good. I've been inspired by your work also to try and get to local parks as much as I can. So I've kind of made that a part of my daily routine, which has definitely helped. Yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Um,
Great.
Seb?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to say I was trying to, but the Spanish government won't allow me. So, unfortunately, our lockdown's a bit stricter. So I'm kind of having to deal with city life. And there's a few trees around my area, but that is literally it. I'm talking three. So not too much nature of the last couple of months, but yeah, we'll definitely get into it.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Lucy, I'm looking forward to talking about your book. But first, can you just tell us a bit about yourself and how the book came about?
Sure. So, I've been a journalist for about 12 or so years. I mostly write about kind of science and health and environment these days. I'm a freelance journalist, so I write for a variety of people like The Guardian and Independent and BBC. I started out writing about music and culture and the arts, which I still do a little bit of. I worked at the Telegraph for a bit, and then NME magazine, and then so I've been freelance since leaving NME about, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago or 7 years ago. The book started life about 8 years ago, when I was recovering from a spell of addiction and depression. And as we will talk about, nature became a really important part of my recovery. So I started to investigate how and why that works. I live in Hampshire in England. Have a couple of young children, and that's me.
Beautiful. Thank you. What came to mind is that Seb and myself were talking last week about how many indigenous cultures view the idea of depression as separation, either from like Mother Earth themselves or the people around them. Would you subscribe to this also?
That's such an interesting question, and that's made me want to look more into that idea. I definitely feel like when I am in a depression, it does feel like a visitor, not necessarily kind of separate, but it does feel kind of like a visiting thing, which when it leaves or when whatever I do, for me it's antidepressants really and therapy. When my last spell of depression, I think, ended about September last year, and I just remember feeling just such a relief when it lifts, of like, wow, it's gone. It's like a cloud that's lifted. So I mean, I don't know whether I see it as separate, because I think I've had spells of depression since I was a late teenager, so it can feel quite familiar when it happens. But yeah, I don't know. What about you? What's your feeling about
that? It makes sense to me, because I guess, for instance, when I'm in a forest, I feel like if ever there were like oppositions or opposing sides, that I am now on one side, if that makes sense. Yeah, like almost the things that I was restricting, maybe a lot of like, I don't know, like negative self-talk or whatever was going on before, just being very stressed. And when I'm in the forest, it feels like there's I don't need to battle this or something. It's very hard to describe, but when I heard that, it did resonate. I kind of understood it. And then if you branch it out further, if you were to look at separation from like themselves or the people around them, I can understand that even further. Because I feel often we aren't given the time or encouraged to take the time to really learn about ourselves and just really be with ourselves with little distractions, and how everybody has such busy schedules that it's often very hard to really get the time to connect with people, because everyone's can only fit into certain schedules. And so I understand it from that point of view. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Gabor Mate, but he branches that even further, and he says a separation or like disconnection from your work, which I have met a lot of people that experience this as well. So when I hear that, like depression as separation or disconnection, it makes more sense than I'm able to articulate right now.
Yeah. What about you? Job of it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. What about you, Seb?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, obviously, I think most people who kind of live in, at least in the Western world, we're probably disconnected from nature anyway, in large parts, especially when you compare us to maybe people who live in the Amazon still. But I definitely feel that I kind of almost feel that depression it's like this evil mistress who kind of makes you want to become a recluse and not kind of get out into the real world, not kind of talk to people. And so I personally feel, whenever I've had my bouts with it, that you have levels of separation, whether that's from your friends, but then even separation from your interests. I mean, I love to cook, I love to write poetry and these things. Whether I'm any good at them is another question. But when I'm kind of in those kind of sad estates, let's say, I feel a separation from those loves and those passions. I don't want to do those things anymore, and I kind of feel completely isolated. And then in kind of contrast to that, to try to make myself feel better, is when I feel that connectivity. When I feel that connectivity with people that I love, when I feel that connectivity with things that I love to do, that's when I kind of feel that I'm kind of crossing over that bridge and getting over that hump. So I think obviously when they talk about it with the Amazonian tribes, I think they kind of deal with it on a much more literal level of separation from the earth, because to them, the earth is everything. It's the provider of their food, it's the provider of their shelter, it's the provider of their medicines, and maybe for us, I think we're almost certainly more disattached than they are. But yeah, I agree with that sentiment, and I think it's a simplistic way of looking at it, but I kind of like that simplicity for sure. I wanted to ask Lucy, you one of your pieces, whilst we're kind of talking about this, you say, and this is just a quote that I took, you said, I understood that time in nature softened the voices in my head and stabilized my mood, but I didn't at the beginning understand what's happening to my body, brain, and mind. How do you differentiate between the brain and the mind? Because it's something that I've been thinking about recently, and when you read that, it really jumped out at me.
Well, I guess it's a funny one, isn't it? Because does the mind even exist? It's quite a nebulous concept. Like, we know what the brain is, it's that organ that is on our heads, but the mind is a little bit more kind of elusive, and there's not really like a concrete definition of it. I guess in that context, I was thinking about the brain from a neuroscientific point of view. So when I'm in nature, for example, I find that the kind of ruminative processes and the brooding, and like, as I say in that quote, the kind of voices in my head quietened. And at that point, when I wrote that sentence, before I'd kind of researched it, I knew a little bit about, the neuroscience of rumination and so on, and the default mode network, which is associated with the sense of self. So I was wanting to investigate that, and think about what neuroscience could tell us about, that relationship between nature and mental health and the brain. I mean, in terms of the mind, I guess that's a much more kind of fluid concept, isn't it? And probably I would use that to mean a kind of a wider variety of cognitive kind of elements and relationships. So
Right.
we don't know much about the brain. Then when I embarked on this inquiry for Losing Eden, I thought maybe I'd find more evidence, but for the brain, I mean, I found absolutely loads of evidence, but what I realized is actually we really don't know that much about the brain. Like, it's all quite fledgling, but we know more about the mind because we can kind of there are studies about how people feel, or what their emotions are, or what their cognition is, or how their memory's doing, those other different facets of the mind, which are kind of, I don't know, more varied. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it is something that I'm very interested in as well, and it's almost like the more I think I'm learning, the more I realize the less I know.
Yeah, right. Right. I
Um,
think also with the with the mind stuff and the quietening of the voices, there's so many ways of looking at that idea, and it's quite a common experience that people go into the natural world and they will say their minds feel kind of soothed or hushed, or they stop worrying. And I guess one of the kind of obvious ways that must work is by distraction, and the fact that if you notice things in nature, which I've been doing a lot more of in the last few weeks because I'm getting out even more than normal, it just kind of takes you out of yourself. And there are kind of avenues of intrigue. If you like spiders, you can look for spiders. If you like colours, you can look for colours. If you're into birds, you can do bird watching. So I guess that's like a simple example of how nature connection can affect the mind.
Yeah, it's. I don't think I've ever met someone that said, "Oh, I don't really enjoy spending time in nature," or "I don't feel better for going there." And I know this is probably a loaded question, but what do you think is really happening to our bodies and our brains when we are surrounded by these trees, these birds, this life that we are so often isolated from?
Well, this was the question that kind of propelled my inquiry. And when I set out to write Losing Eden, I thought there'd probably be one kind of silver bullet piece of evidence, maybe, to explain why being in the woods or by the sea feels good. But in fact, what I found, and which blew my mind, was that it's a really it's more like a club sandwich of effects. So, for example, when you say you're in a wood, or a forest, or a park, or so on, nature, you recover from stress more quickly and more completely in a natural environment compared to a built environment. The reason that is because contact with the trees and the green activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the one associated with kind of rest and digest processes and calming down, as opposed to the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, which you just don't want to be in too much because it can lead to inflammation. And that's the kind of side of the nervous system which is probably switched on a little too much for people who live in towns and cities. The roads are really busy, and you've got someone trolling you online, and you've got to pay your mortgage, or all these kind of things, which now mean that we are in a kind of slightly stressed out state more than then it's good for us, and hence why stress-related illnesses are on the rise. So the nervous system is one way. And then one of the things I found really interesting, which when I heard this, I thought this must be kooky. This is woo-woo kind of rubbish. So this is the idea that, when you are around soil, if you get soil in your hands, it has an antidepressant-like effect. So the idea is that there is a microbacteria found in soil which has serotonin enhancing qualities. And so I looked into this, and actually it is absolutely true. So there's a lot of evidence and brilliant studies showing that this one bacteria, which is in soil, when kind of ingested, so inhaled, if you're out and about and so on, it actually has an antidepressant-like effect, which explains maybe why so many people get a buzz from gardening. And then one of my favourite findings was about petrichor, which is a beautiful word which means the smell of the earth after it has rained. And studies suggest that compound activates brain waves associated with calmness and relaxation. And then there's so many things I could mention. There's the circadian rhythms and the sunlight. There's negative air ions, which are found around kind of water and the sea, which have antidepressant-like effects. There's all the brain evidence, immune function, lowering of inflammation. I kind of when I started this journey, I thought, I have a lot of friends who don't, like you were saying, Jim. It's not like they'd say they feel worse after being in a park, but they don't go to nature for their relaxation. They watch telly or go to a club or all the things lots of people do for their rest and relaxation. But what I found with writing Losing Eden was that even if you're not a tree hugger or someone who wants to go wild swimming all the time, being around background nature is really crucial for individual and population level mental health. So the amount of trees you have on your street, if you can walk through a park to the shops instead of down a busy street, just having a little bit of nature in your life also has measurable impacts as well, which of course has kind of social implications too for how we design our societies.
Lucy, when we talk about immersing yourself in nature, I think especially maybe as people from the UK think of woods and green rolling fields, but that kind of strikes me as a very British centric view. Are there any other habitats that are just as beneficial? I'm thinking about a desert in Mexico, for example, or rocky mountainous regions. Is there one specific element that is beneficial above all others? I mean, people kind of naturally think that flowing water is inherently relaxing, for example.
That's a really interesting question. I looked into kind of preference judgments and the kind of psychology of nature and aesthetics in the context of this idea biophilia, which was popularized by a biologist called E.O. Wilson. And it's the idea that because we evolved and have spent 99% of our human evolutionary history in the natural world, we have a kind of genetic disposition and an innate kind of drawing towards nature. And in this field, people have found that across the board, scientists have found across the board, people tend to favour landscapes which are similar to those of the savannah, where we evolved. So that will be things, kind of a plain, certain type of tree called an acacia tree, which has kind of spreading canopy, little leaves, but spreads quite far. A bit of water, as you say, and then there's this idea of prospect refuge, which is that you could have a prospect, so as in a view across, so you're able to see what's going on, and then refuge, so there might be a tree you could shelter in, or so on. So that kind of those elements have been found across the board to be preferred by people. And I think, I mean, you could kind of get that from a rocky mountainous range, even a desert, to
Hmm.
like a posh English garden. But those tend to be the environments people are drawn to, and I mean the kind of environments that wealthy people will build the land in that way. That
Yeah.
is borne out. But it's a really interesting point about different landscapes. I think most of us live in urban areas. Most of us live in towns and cities, and don't have access to woodlands or forests or mountains. But what I found was that urban nature and kind of even like a road verge or a park
Hmm.
and street trees have a really important effect on people's mental health. One study found that the more trees on a street seem to be linked somehow to lesser antidepressant prescriptions on that street. Which isn't to say, and I make this point in Losing Eden, look at more trees, throw your pills away,
Yeah.
because that's obviously not what, that would be ridiculous. But it just suggests that, even a tree or a park is better than nothing. And on that whole antidepressant thing, I do like to make the point that nature was part of my recovery alongside psychiatry and psychotherapy, because it's not a cure-all, and sometimes I can feel absolutely rubbish, and going into nature doesn't help at all, and that's really annoying. So I don't want to set it up as like something which is going to cure depression, because it's much more complicated than that. I've been on antidepressants most of the last 10 years, and I need to have them, and nature as a kind of maintainer. So
Right.
I like to make that point, that it's part of, it's a therapeutic potential,
Yeah.
but not
Yeah.
going to
Important to make
cure.
that distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. You mentioned just when you're answering that, you kind of touched on gardens, and I kind of had a point where I want to ask you, when you talk about the importance of nature and immersing yourself in it, I wonder whether gardens have the same impact. Like, humans are notorious and incredibly successful at forcing our environments to bend to our will. Do you think a hyper-controlled environment, such as a Japanese garden, for example, can have the same effects as walking through the woods? Do we need that element of wild, quote unquote, in order to truly benefit from nature?
That's such a good question and really interesting. So I think, humans are heterogeneous. Everyone's different. We're all quite diverse. You might love very neatly designed hanging baskets. I might love swimming in kind of wild rivers. There doesn't seem to be a kind of template, as it were, apart from
Right.
the landscape, the kind of savanna landscape that I've mentioned.
Mm.
I think gardening. There's a lot of evidence for gardening improving mental health, and that's just growing all the time at the moment. There's also evidence about the biodiversity of nature being linked to better mental health. So, for
Hmm.
example, listening to birdsong has been linked to kind of higher feelings of well-being and decreased stress. But if the birdsong is more diverse, so if there's more different types of birdsong, that effect is increased. And there's going to be more birdsong in wilder areas, or even community gardens in urban areas, which are
Mm.
which are created in order to provide habitats for biodiversity and lots of different species. Saying that, it is all cultural preferences. Some people will just like to have very neat flower beds. That's not something that I particularly like. But that's not to say that I'm right. I mean, obviously, monocultures are not great for nature.
Mm.
But these things are very culturally influenced as well. It's a very complicated relationship, which is why it was so interesting to write a book about it. And there was a lot of this area in the hinterland of Losing Eden, which was cut in the end, but about kind of preferences and the idea of the wild and the wilderness, and how the wilderness only really exists if you live in an industrialized, developed nation. But it's such a kind of nebulous concept almost. Like I feel wild when I'm swimming in a river in Hampshire where I live and I've got like bugs in my hair or whatever. But I am
Yeah.
like 3 minutes from a busy road. So, yeah. What about you guys? What are your kind of nature preferences? Like, what would be like your ideal restorative
I would say
landscapes?
I would definitely say flowing water for me is big. If I can find like a ravine or a stream or something like that, that's big for me. I used to live in Hampshire. I used to live in Alton.
Oh yeah, I know that.
Yeah, and my mum and dad spent hours on like this Japanese kind of garden, which is kind of where the question came from. Wonder how much use that actually was, but it was tiered and all sorts.
Lovely.
It couldn't have been more controlled if it tried. But I definitely I like that. And then just like you said, plains, like you said, just kind of that open expanse for me is huge. I'm not too keen on mountains. We used to have a house up there once in Italy in the mountains, and whilst the views are spectacular, kind of I'm too lazy to want to hike for 3 hours to, people say you have to earn those views. I'd just rather have them at your doorstep.
Yeah.
But so yeah, for me, plains and like some sort of kind of flowing water is huge for me. And then I'm not sure if this kind of ties in, but weather. I've moved to Spain, and all of my Spanish friends who had moved to England and then they've consequently moved back to Spain, they always complained about the weather, and I always thought, what a load of tosh. I mean, you just get used to it, like my dad, who's Italian, he always said, I didn't move to England for the weather, I moved to England for the job opportunities. So you've made your bed, now lie in it. And I agreed with him, and then I moved out to Spain and I realized how much difference, not the heat necessarily, but light, having light all throughout the day, basically. 9 months of the year. I mean, we can sit out in a terrace in Madrid almost year round, and that makes a huge difference, because I've noticed it makes a difference in culture as well. In Spain, you don't spend a lot of time in your house because the weather's so good. And so the whole culture in Spain is to be outside, right? To be outside with your friends and socializing,
nice.
And that's purely because of the weather. So obviously it is nature, I suppose. So yeah, light, trickling water, and green fields for me would be like the biggest 3 kind of ingredients if I could have them. And what about yourself, Jim?
For sure. Well, when I was living in Denmark for the last 6 months, and almost every day we would just run into the cold sea over the winter, and I can hands down say it's like a top 3 feeling, like of the feelings I've ever felt. Like you just feel so at peace and calm. It's that's pretty untouchable in terms of the feeling you get after it, although it is incredibly difficult and incredibly cold. The other thing is just being surrounded by trees, for sure. Yeah, that does it for me also. Just like hearing the birds sing, and no like recent noise, if that makes sense. Like the idea of a car beeping or something modern, it's just nice to be able to, theoretically I could have been here a few hundred years ago and nothing would have changed. That's nice
It's
for me.
interesting that you guys both mentioned water. I think that one of the things that I discovered, which another thing I thought, come on, this cannot be for real, is the this thing called negative ions. So it's like kind of so when there's flowing water, like a waterfall or a sea or anything where water is kind of flowing and being the atoms are being kind of pushed together, that actually that releases ions into the air, which in studies have been found to increase serotonin in humans. I mean, it's just like, what? Because there's a river I go swimming in near me, which is super cold, and I relate to what you're saying, Jim, about the calming, the peace of swimming in cold water. And I always used to sit on this waterfall bit and just like chill. And then I read this these studies, and I was like, oh my God, it's not just the water and the coldness and the trees, it's also what's in the air. There's so much that we can't see because our senses are quite basic compared with other animals. But that's one of the things which I found quite cool.
Lucy, just a quick question, just to follow up. I just asking this purely because I know Jim is a bit of a freak and he's a fan of cold showers. In fact, he only ever has cold showers, which I just can't get my head around. But the question, because I scold myself when I go into the shower, but the question is can that almost be replicated in the home scenario? I'm just thinking in terms of, a cold shower maybe replicating kind of a waterfall. You've got that flowing water, and then maybe a hot kind of stagnant bath, for example, where the water is just kind of still and not really moving. Is there any kind, have you looked into that? Is there any kind of research that would show that maybe they kind of replicate, and maybe there is actually method in Jim's madness?
I haven't looked at the research for like cold showers, although I'm sure there must be some, because it is quite common, and athletes do it, don't they? Or people have kind of cold baths, ice baths, and so on. So the I can talk about, so that there's studies which suggest that when the body is in cold water, the kind of the stress mechanisms are triggered, and then that can lead to the release of endorphins.
Right.
My husband and me were talking about this the other day, because he was like, we should just get like a big bucket full of cold water for you in the garden that you can just jump in. Because that would help, because I find that swimming in cold water is like so effective for me when I am having bad mental health. And I said to him, yeah, but for me it is the experience of like being in nature as well. So kind of the mixture of the water, but also like at the moment, like the damselflies, the dragonflies, the mayflies, the the sound of the cuckoo, etc. Which makes it just like, but then I think that there's lots of anecdotal evidence about cold water swimming. But yeah, I don't know about the cold shower. For me, it wouldn't be the same. But I don't know. What about Jim? You do it, and is that a kind of mental health thing?
For sure, right? I was only going to say, this morning I woke up, and I don't know if you get, sometimes I feel kind of down, but I can't even attribute a reason for it. And that happened this morning, and it took me a while to get out of bed. And I just went into the cold shower, and I swear after, that's exactly how I felt. Like just stuff was going on in my body that I didn't know what, but it felt amazing. And then it was just like endorphins were running through me. I almost felt like a little high, and then just my attitude just completely flipped.
How long do you do it for? How long are you in the cold shower for?
It depends. It depends on the day. I would say between 3 or 4 minutes.
I'm going to do this. Okay, I'm going to try this.
Yes, Lucy.
Cool.
Yes.
And you do it every day?
About once every 5 or 6 days, I treat myself to a hot shower.
Wow.
Yeah,
and
maniac.
You appreciate it so much more, I swear.
Wow. Okay, you've inspired me. I'm going to try it out.
Okay, Lucy, please tell me if you don't feel significantly better after, because I've never heard someone come out of a cold shower and feel like a bit lethargic and they didn't know what they're going to do today, and
yeah.
But maybe that's because they felt so bad during the cold shower that once it ended, it was almost like, oh, thank God for this. We're out. The punishment has finally ended, Whereas when you have a hot shower, it's that soothing feeling that I drained the tank. My poor girlfriend has to have a cold shower after I'm in there, because I'll be in there for half an hour. So I don't know. You go ahead, Lucy, but I'll stick to my hot showers.
Don't worry, Lucy. We'll get Seb someday. Lucy, I wanted to ask, right? Am I right in saying there appears to be a correlation between the frequency with which somebody experiences awe and their expression of compassion and kindness?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting, relatively new science called the science of awe, which comes out of California, Berkeley, and it's this guy called Dasha Keltner who's been studying awe how it affects people's bodies and minds. Well, it affects them a lot more than you might think. So obviously we all like to feel awed, and for many of us that would be through kind of a natural experience like a waterfall, or just something beautiful like blossom even, maybe. But for others it could be a beautiful piece of, like, a Jimi Hendrix solo, or an amazing painting. So awe has mental health benefits. It also has been found to predict reduced levels of cytokines, which is a biomarker which tells us about inflammation. And you do not want loads of inflammation. It's just not good for you at all. So it suggests that it's good kind of physically and mentally. But in terms of compassion, so one of the paths these guys went down was testing how awe might change perceptions of the self and of other people, and how we behave and treat others. So what they did is they showed a group of participants a video of canyons and mountains and other awe-inspiring scenery, and they showed another group a kind of a natural scene that was supposed to be funny, which I don't even know what that could have been. I tried to find out. I thought it might be like a bear slipping on a banana skin or something. I just do not know. But anyway, and afterwards the groups were told that they won a prize, and asked if they wanted to share the cash prize with strangers. And the people in the awed group were happy to and wanted to share, and then the non-awe group were less keen. And they replicated this experiment a number of times. In one, I think they did something like, they showed one group some beautiful massive tree, redwoods or something, and another group a building. And then they dropped pens on the floor, a load of pens, and then the tree group were more likely to help pick the pens up, and the other group were not. So they concluded that people are more kind and generous and ethical after feeling awe. And I guess that, it kind of makes sense on one level of, if you're in a good mood. I don't know about you, but if I feel good, I'm more likely to be nice. If I'm in a terrible mood, I'm probably a bit ratty and cranky and difficult to be around. But also they looked at what was happening in the brain in this experiment, and they found that awe was actually reducing activity in the area associated with the sense of self, which is the default mode network. And that relates a lot to my personal experience of addiction and recovery, which is that, when I was kind of in the thick of it, and it's the same when I've had periods of depression since, I'm very much kind of, it's all brooding about the self, and kind of can't really get past what's going on in my mind. Whereas, it's something that in kind of the recovery groups that I've been part of, they talk about it as Addiction FM, or the washing machine head of, this kind of buzzing of just like self-hatred, basically. But I have found since that being awed, does seem to kind of take me out of myself when I can become, in that kind of brooding state. So yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because only last week I was chatting to my friend Will with a podcast that will come out in the future about his road to recovery, and he refers to his brain as like a beehive, and that there's just constantly all these buzzing bees just everywhere, and
that's good. I can relate to that.
Yeah. But it also, when I read that this awe research, it made so much sense to me as well, because I don't know, when I think of awe, I think of seeing something so beautiful that is so much bigger than me, that like all of a sudden you're like, oh, there's something bigger than me. And then maybe, like you said, something small, like, I don't know, leaving some food for somebody that you maybe wanted the last piece of something, or picking up pens, something like this. All of a sudden it's not even a question of would I or should I. It's of course, because there are other people, there's something, it's not just me. you know.
Mm.
Yeah, and
That's
it was
a
just,
good point. Yeah, I
yeah.
think it also there's Rachel Carson who wrote Silent Spring, which was a kind of talisman for me for losing Eden about pesticides, which kind of kickstarted the environmental movement in the 60s.
Yeah.
She wrote about how wonder would leaven and kind of reduce our appetite for destruction as a society. And I think that speaks a bit, that kind of idea really interested me. And, you know, I guess like if you're not in touch with the bigger things, the not able to look at the night sky and the stars, or see a kind of 2,000-year-old tree, or be kind of aware of how interconnected we are with such a big family of things. I think that can lead to this kind of sense that we have in our Western societies, that humans are top of the hierarchy, and that we can take what we like. And so perhaps, if certain leaders, like Donald Trump, I don't know, were more awed or more kind of in touch with those huge things. And I think actually, that they might be less kind of destructive and hateful. I think that speaks a lot to climate change denial as well. That climate change and natural disasters and so on, they are kind of awesome in the the kind of
Power.
fundamental meaning of the word, exactly. And it's much easier if you are part of the systems that want to deny climate change and create, continue business as usual, to deny that those things have the power that they do. So I think, the science of war it's a pretty interesting and big deal. I think it's more than it like a lot of these things with losing Eden. Like once I scratched the surface, I was like, oh my, there's a lot here. It's really
big time. When you consider the future, assuming that there isn't like a huge change in public policy or consciousness, do you envisage like a weaker, less happy race of people because of their isolation from nature? Or do you think we're already seeing the evidence of this right now?
Yeah, I think we are already seeing it. So our disconnection from the natural world and our negative treatment of it is at kind of unprecedented level. Like we spend between 1% and 5% of our time outdoors, so much less than ever in our human history. And, we live lives very estranged from the natural world and the living, the processes which are our kind of living support system. We don't see how our food is made or how the land is used, and so on. We are very disconnected from the earth, which gives us all things, including our breath and our food, and the things that we need to keep us alive. And I think that when I was looking into this idea that disconnection from nature could actually be a factor in kind of mental health crisis in the West, and whether planetary despair was a real thing. At the beginning, I thought, this sounds crazy. Like, it sounds a bit far out, the idea that our disconnection from nature is making us mentally ill, or at least, not healthy mentally. As I kind of walked through this journey and talked to people, I did get to the point where I thought, there's no way that we can be living these lives where we are all complicit in like the destruction of habitats, and huge kind of species reduction rates and so on, and it not to affect us even on a subconscious level. And I guess the other side of that is that the more evidence I found for the importance of nature for mental health, the more I realised that as we overlook it as a society, we are doing ourselves a disservice, and worse, it's almost a harm. So to box communities into flats in cities which have no outside space or no access to parks or high quality green space is harming those people, because it is disallowing them from experiencing, the now proven mental health benefits of contact with nature. But I'm interested in you, Seb, in Madrid, because you talked about how there's not a lot of nature there. So I'm interested in what you might think about that, and whether.
Yeah, I mean, Madrid has some of Retiro Park is my favorite park that I've been to. It's one of my favorite parks, and so there are forms of the nature around, but it's not the greenest city you've ever been. I think there's enough. I've definitely experienced in lockdown, obviously, because we've had much stricter kind of measurements enforced. We haven't really been. They've only just got lifted, but even then, so I've definitely realized kind of the importance and how much we take it for granted. Having said all of that, I've been kind of debating it because I'm interested in the idea of kind of ownership of land, right? So we talk about Madrid, and any Spaniard would tell you, oh, that's our capital city, city made of humans for us, kind of built for our needs, right? Same with London or any other major city. And then only recently, in fact, when I was over in Christmas in London visiting some friends, we were walking back from a night out, and I saw like this fox in the road. And it was like this like the clearest example of this juxtaposition between nature and kind of human life, which we've built for us, and how nature kind of adapts, and especially when you talk about animals, right? And then you see the pictures during lockdown of all of these animals returning to these cities that they maybe haven't been to for maybe even centuries. And I was wondering kind of if you think this show speaks to the resilience of nature and its ability to bounce back, but do you think we should try to reincorporate nature in some form back into our cities and live in union with it? Is that even possible? I'm talking about animals, maybe more than green spaces here, I suppose, but I'm an animal nut, and to me, even if it's just a fox, which maybe isn't the most kind of exotic animal in the world, or a badger, if you see a badger, you're like, Jesus Christ, look at that! It's something that's so different, and I think maybe when I see those, I don't know, I kind of feel like Jim said, you're kind of realizing the sense of oneness, the sense of connectivity. Oh, it's not just humans, and actually, we don't own the world; we're just custodians of it, right? As the kind of the maybe most intelligent species there is today anyway. I was wondering do you think that there's a possibility, I just think it'd be such a shame, for example, you see Venice, right, where you see like the water's crystal clear, there's, I think, dolphins have returned or something like that, and you think, this is going to be such a shame if we don't learn any lessons from this kind of travesty and tragic period that we've gone through, and then if all of a sudden we get loads of cruises back again and the water gets sullied and there's no more dolphins, and then we just kind of revert to type. Do you think it's possible for us to incorporate animals and human life in cities?
Definitely. I think we can do so much more than we already do. So on my street, which is in like a town in Hampshire, a lot of the verges have been left unmown because councils are focusing on the virus more. And previously I might have thought road verges, how boring, like not interested. But just by walking around more in my local area, and stopping to actually look, I've seen an abundance of species of insect in these verges, like bees and all sorts of other pollinators and beetles and lots of different wildflowers. And it just shows that if you give the rest of nature a chance to bounce back, it does it pretty quickly. And I just don't understand how, we're living in a biodiversity crisis. Insects have reduced by loads of percentage, and that's really bad news for everybody, including humans. And yet we mow all of our road verges and roundabouts, and we don't plant for pollinators. There's so much green space which could be just given over to other species and other animals. And there is an exciting movement called biophilic cities.
Mm-hmm.
So Singapore is an example of that. Detroit is an example of that, which I write about in Losing Eden, which is quite an interesting story because obviously Detroit was kind of absolutely hammered and left like abandoned, really.
Yeah, up to Ford.
Yeah, exactly. But in the last however many years, there's now like an abundance of community gardens, and people have been kind of rewilding vacant lots, and it's now a biophilic city, and the impacts of that can be really profound. Like you say, habitats for animals, but also
Mm-hmm.
kind of in increasing community, so food growing and kind of food donating, and just having more of a kind of community vibe, using the land together. It's something that I've experienced in the last 6 months, where I started to feel pretty bummed out about the planet, and but in the journey of Losing Eden, obviously it was a lot about the positives of nature and mental health, but the flip side of it is the negatives of our estrangement from nature, and how climate change and so on will affect our minds. And as an antidote to that, there's a patch of green, like old lawn at the back of our houses, just left. And so I got together with my neighbours and contacted the councillor, and we're planting it up to be a kind of nature garden. And what I'm hoping is that we'll put bat boxes up, and bird boxes, and swift boxes, and maybe a fox might be able to forage in there. I don't know. But just like letting it go for the rest of nature, and that's just a little example of like vacant areas which can be optimized to allow for the rest of nature, for sure. My first book was about foxes, and I love foxes.
Yeah, I know that's why I brought up the example. I was like, let's see if I can. But I mean, you talk about that. The name escapes me now, and it's gonna bug me. But they were on Desert Island Discs. It's gonna really annoy me. But anyway, there was a guest on there, and they had an estate. They were left an
Isabella
estate.
III. Yeah.
Yes, that's the one. Yes, and they're like kind of rewilding that whole estate, because basically nothing was growing, and they were trying to see how could they kind of get this farm to be back up and functioning again. And then they were talking about how they had like thorns growing, and they were going, their neighbors were complaining that it's an absolute state and it was really ugly and this, that, and the other. And then she just said that we left it and we kind of trusted in nature. We were like, look, these thorns are getting a bit out of hand here, but look, we've said that we're not going to touch anything, so let's just not touch anything and see what happens. And then, if I can remember correctly, I think she said something along the lines of like, there was no worries. Something along the lines of like there was a load of butterflies or something happened like in that nature that kind of took control of the thorns, the thorny bushes, and now they have cows there, and the cows are left free to wander, and it can be a bit of a nightmare to try and find them all because they're left free just to wander all over. Almost like wild animals. And I'm wondering if you've we talk about nature in terms of parks and stuff, but also, where we get our food from. I read a stat somewhere that the broccoli that we eat now compared to the broccoli that we ate in the 1970s is something like 60% has less nutrition in it.
Sorry.
No worries. So yeah, it has something like 60% less nutrition in it, or something along those lines. And I was wondering, do you believe, I mean, that's a clear example, right? But do you believe that we could do more, and that maybe farmers could do more to have kind of wild habitats? Like you said, monocultures are not good for wildlife. Do you think we could do more to kind of maybe enforce that or promote that idea that through wildlife you can still grow enough food to kind of support the human population, and actually better quality food as a result?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most important things that we need to think. Oh, I'm so sorry. My mum keeps...
No worries.
I thought like...
Shout out to Lucy's mum.
Yeah, I turned off like my FaceTime and stuff. She's in Scotland, so obviously don't see her now. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, I think how we use the land for agriculture has to change, and has to be kind of one of the priorities of thinking about how we live kind of more in harmony with the rest of nature, and reduce some of our negative impact. There are some really great organic farmers and kind of sustainable regenerative farmers out there who are using their land. There's a guy called James Rebanks who wrote the book The Shepherd's Life. He's really worth following on Twitter if you're on Twitter and you're interested in this kind of thing, because he is doing so much to his land to kind of produce food which people need, but also bring in rivers and hedgerows and habitats for animals, and he's really showing how it's possible for it to be done. But I guess and this kind of speaks to other conversations other little chats we've had, there does maybe need to be a kind of overhaul or like a recalibration of our relationship with the natural world and with the land. From kind of, foxes are still seen as pests and vermin, and people shoot them, and they're kind of loathed in many places, and farmers are subsidized by the government, not to support other animals on their land, but to kind of produce as high a yield as possible. So I think that these things need to be part of a kind of an almost like an emergency turning towards a different way of thinking about how we are stewards of the land, and how to be good humans and allow space for other species and live kind of sustainably with the rest of nature.
Yeah, even on a more like a local or a more personal level, I wanted to ask, like, do you think people, particularly living in the West, actually know how much needs to change if we are to live in closer harmony with the natural world? The example that comes to mind is, and I don't want to bash my dad, I love my dad, but when I came back from living in Denmark for a few months, I was explaining to him that the place we live, that we use the toilet paper we put the toilet paper in the bin and not down the toilet, because we never think of where the paper goes, but surely that's not the best for the environment. And I said it to my dad, and I was like, what do you think about possibly it taking off here? And he just looks at me, he's like, I just don't think it will take off, son. and this it's I wonder, like, have you had a personal anecdote, or have you thought about how difficult it's going to be to actually, hey guys, almost everything we do needs to change in some manner if we really are serious about this?
Yeah, I guess whenever I, like, not wanting to bash my mum, but whenever I go up to see her, and I kind of try not to eat as like meat that much, and try and be plant-based as much as I can, and it's always been a bit of an issue, like even that I was brought up with meat 3 times a day. Every single meal had meat when I was a child. That was it's not a meal if it doesn't have meat. And I think that can be quite challenging to people. I mean, even things like I think it's really interesting talking to kind of older generations about kind of climate change and nature disconnection and so on, because you got to be I think shame is really toxic. And I find if I'm sometimes talking to someone of an older generation, a boomer who is living like a life where they're flying loads and etc., and not really wanting to think about their carbon footprint, and it's not my responsibility to correct anyone's behaviors. I mean, I'm hardly living like a particularly carbon-free lifestyle, obviously, but I think there is quite a lot of shame and defensiveness, and I think that is one of the real big obstacles in maybe that kind of older group who have a lot of voting power and a lot of financial power, seeing that like things are going to have to change, because it kind of, maybe it's like a criticism of how they've chosen to live their lives, and no one wants to think, I've spent however many decades ruining the planet. It's like a horrible thing to think of. I think everyone, and I think that means that, there's a lot of denial, and a kind of unconscious. It's something that the farmer Wendell Berry talks about, a kind of unconscious planetary suicide that none of us can kind of see what we're doing, but also we don't want to know because it's a horrific thought. So, but like, I think I was probably less hopeful until the last couple of years, where the climate activism and XR and Greta and the Sunrise Movement, and seeing climate change on the front pages, that seems like a new thing. It does feel like something is changing, maybe. And I don't know. I think what I've found is that doing little things locally, community things, whereas I may have in the past dismissed that as not being, I think just feeling kind of a bit disenfranchised and thinking there's nothing I can do to make a difference. But actually, if people do little things, then just from leaving your lawn unmown, or thinking about where to spend your money, and thinking about a reciprocal relationship with the land rather than a dysfunctional one.
Yeah,
it would be better.
Small step by small step.
Yeah. What do you guys think? Are you kind of hopeful, or do you think that we could change, or do you not think so?
I'm skeptical.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this coronavirus and thinking of how much will human behavior change. Just forget nature, just in terms of maybe connection with our friends. Now we realize how important it is once we've been once that option's been taken away from us. How important will it be to connect with our friends and maintain the good habits that we've kind of built up during this lockdown? And there's a part of me that's optimistic and goes, yeah, I think we'll all make a change. But then there's also a part of me, this is talking about myself as well, who goes, yeah, but maybe after 2 or 3 months we'll revert back to type. And when I think about, and that's just kind of in every aspect. And then when I think of the, you look at Brazil, for example, and what that prime minister over there is doing, the president over there is doing, when it's fueled with financial greed, and these conglomerates are just earning millions, if not billions, at the expense, obviously, of wildlife, animals, or whatever it may be. I find it difficult to think that will change on a global scale. I do think, obviously, you see the movement of veganism, for example, vegetarianism, and even people who, like me, I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan, but I definitely try to eat less meat, like you say, instead of eating 3 times a day, maybe just once a day or something like that. I think that might change, but I wonder how much, and then you look at, the fact that Britain, for example, we didn't meet our targets that we made a decade ago, and many other countries didn't meet theirs. And so I think there's a part of me that wants to be optimistic and go, yeah, I think we can do this. But then there's a part of me that goes, history would tell you otherwise,
Yeah, but then I guess, things are going to change whether we like it or not. So it's like, the predictions for 40, 50 years, I think about this a lot because of my young children. I'm terrified every day because I think, are they going to survive past 40? So yeah, I think you might be right that we won't be able to make a change quick enough. But then things will change, and it will be much worse for kind of, people of color, or people in less affluent societies, and it's just going to exacerbate inequalities. So I don't know.
Sure.
I find I'm pessimistic too, but I think rallying against it is better than not.
Yeah, and I think the one of the good things that this lockdown has shown is that bounce back ability that nature has. I mean, we were seeing those pictures of dolphins returning to Venice after maybe 2 to 3 weeks after the lockdown, which given the circumstances, no time at all. And that's not to say that Italy should go into a lockdown for 2 to 3 weeks every year to kind of balance out the amount of cruise ships that go to Venice. But it just goes to show that maybe actually we don't need such drastic measures to potentially get fruitful results. Maybe it kind of shows the resilience that nature has, and if we kind of can heed those lessons, then maybe we can learn. But like you said, I try to be optimistic, but there's always that nagging thought in the back of my head that goes, how many leaders like Donald Trump are really bothered about how many leopards there are in the jungle when they can make billions? I don't know.
Lucy, I watched your recent interview with Nick Hunt, and one point that was raised, which I thought was quite interesting, was that given all the research surrounding the benefits of nature to our health, that there might be a potential danger in the future of people maybe looking at nature as like a service that gives us something, which would also miss the point,
Yeah, I think that's a really important question and idea, which I was really conscious of in the writing of Losing Eden. So obviously I was writing a book about why spending time in natural world or not affects our mental health. Obviously that was coming at it from quite a mechanistic point of view and thinking about what nature can give us and what we're getting from it. Mm-hmm. But I also wanted to kind of weave into the book, and this is how I feel, that the even just the idea of nature, like the word is kind of absurd because we are nature. Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of a false difference. I think that we do as a society see nature as, what can it give us? So we have phrases like natural capital, which is how the government in the UK considers the natural environment. So what can it give us? How much is it worth? So the other day, it was a figure came out for what nature in Britain is worth, and it was like some trillions or something. And I think that just kind of, it's just like a gross and like the wrong way of thinking about it. Yeah. But saying that, it is how a lot of people think. I wasn't too worried about, setting up nature as a place to go as a treatment or as a with therapeutic potential, because I do think that, from what I can see, if people have that kind of connection or reconnection with the natural world, it does lead to a kind of feeling of love and affection and respect. And the evidence shows that that it can lead to pro-environmental and conservation behaviours. So while I do think it's like an important thing to think about, and I think the way we talk about, like, making the woods work for us, or how can we, when I was applying for funding for this nature garden at the back of my house, it was like, how is this in the public interest? It's like, does it have to be? Like, can it not just be for nature? But saying that, I think we're so estranged and we're so disconnected that I think we're quite far away from it being a problem, and actually like a renewal of wonder and awe and love and care is what's needed. And if that's going to be from someone, hearing about nature and mental health and going to a park and using that park to soothe their minds, I don't think that's a problem. And it's certainly, for me, as the kind of my journey of nature connection has continued, I've definitely wanted to find a kind of reciprocal relationship. So growing up, like, I kind of remember, it's so horrible to admit this, but I think I remember being on walks with my family and it being like okay to throw litter around or something, or okay to pick flowers, and just like stuff like that, which, like having more of a kind of care ethic and thinking, how can I give back to nature, or what can I do in my little ways to like make it a less dysfunctional relationship,
Yeah. Thanks for that, Lucy. You've already touched on it, I guess, with you talk about your garden. I wanted to ask, how has your life changed, or what changes have you made in your life since making the discoveries you had with losing Eden?
I think that now, like, whereas I might have thought going for a walk outside was not like self-indulgent, but like was a kind of extra, or like, I mean, having young children, any tiny parcel of time, I kind of think, oh, I should just be with the kids or something. You know, anything that's self-care, it's really tricky to build any self-care in because they need so much. But now I would say, actually, me going to like my cemetery park next to my house for half an hour is really important for my mental health. It's not just like a kind of, oh, it feels good. It's like, okay, I know now that there are so many different pathways by which nature connection affects mental health that I'm going to make sure we do it. So in lockdown, for example, we have been going for a walk every day, just like without fail. Obviously, we're lucky that we're able to do that over here. But that as a kind of preventative measure, I think has helped. And then I suppose also with the evidence. So one of my favourite things I found out for losing Eden was about fractals, which are shapes which are found all over the place in nature. And it's like the same shape, but repeated and replicated in increasing size. And they're everywhere, like trees, leaves, flowers, plants. And I found some amazing evidence which showed that when we look at fractals, our areas of the brain associated with calmness and relaxation are activated. And that looks like it's because the human eye itself is fractal. So it kind of locks into place. And so now I know that, for example, I'm always looking for fractals, which you can find in the weeds popping out of the cracks in the pavement. And I will take a moment to look at them rather than just run past them, because I know this could be making my brain feel good, you know? So little things like that help.
Nice. Thanks, Lucy. You've been amazing. But before we let you go, we like to ask our guests, what do they do to keep on top of their mental health? Now, I'm assuming that you've mentioned that you go to the cemetery close to your house on a regular daily basis. Are there any other perhaps measures
when I can, I go swimming in the rivers. Nice. Well, I mean, I do take an antidepressant. Haven't had therapy for a while, but that's always something that I'm very keen on. Let me think. Reading. I love reading. And sleep. Oh my goodness, sleep is major for me. For me, it's just like, if I am sleep deprived, my mental health is affected massively. So that it's so boring, but going to bed early, rock and roll. That's me.
Has it ever happened where you've had too much sleep and then also felt that your mental health was a bit out of whack?
Yeah, that's weird when that happens, isn't it?
Yeah.
What about you guys? What are you doing at the moment to keep your mental health up?
Well, basically since the virus outbreak and the lockdown, I've been waking up and kind of just reminding myself that I have to do these 3 things before I can do anything else, because if I don't do these 3 things, then I might not feel that good throughout the day. And, you know, I was saying to Seb the other day how, like, you know, sometimes where you should do something, but then your mind is trying to give you like outs on not to do it, you know, saying, but it's raining today, and you did this yesterday, or this and this. But I just, every time I wake up, I really try to leave the house, get some exercise, have the cold shower, and meditate. And then whatever happens after that, I think I'm usually in decent stead. Like I'm usually in good, decent condition for whatever the day throws.
Yeah, I don't do the cold showers, as we've touched on, but the exercise is big now that we're allowed out, especially during coronavirus. We've been allowed out for only a certain period of time of day, but that's been big. And then I like to write poems, that may be stuff that's kind of on my mind, or maybe sometimes at times I have a theme, like I'm going to write a happy poem now, and then all of a sudden it's like the darkest poem you've ever seen, and it just kind of feel like that needed to come out some way, shape or form. So that's kind of good. And then I've been trying to listen to music. But when I say listen to music, I mean just sitting there and just listening to the music, like not listening to it whilst you do something else, cooking or reading or anything else like that, just to really try to take in that music has been big. And then since now that we've kind of spoken about the awe-inspiring research, I've been thinking that maybe because we're only allowed out in Madrid from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. or 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. or 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. I'm thinking maybe if I could get a run in and see like the sunrise, then that if I could do that on a daily basis, then that would be awe-inspiring, and maybe that might help. So I haven't done that yet, just to make that clear. But I might try to if I can actually find the willpower to get out of bed. Then I'll try to do that in kind of after being inspired by this conversation. But Lucy, thank you so much for coming on. It's been fascinating stuff. I just wanted to give you the chance to kind of plug yourself, all the books you've written, obviously, and where people can find you, on Twitter, and maybe even the publications. Obviously, I know you're a freelancer, but maybe the publications that you kind of work for most frequently. So if people want to look out for your stuff, where they could find it.
Sure. So my latest book, Losing Eden: Why Our Minds Need the Wild, is out now, published by Alan Lane. You can get it wherever you normally get your books. My first book, Foxes Unearthed, is also in the same places. I write a column for The Independent. I write quite a lot for The Guardian, and kind of other places too. I'm on Twitter, Lucy Jones, and I'm on Instagram. And I just post quite a lot of nature shots. So that's
very
wholesome stuff. Wholesome stuff.
Very wholesome.
Exactly. If you're stuck in a city, just go to Lucy's social media and you feel like you've been immersed. But no, great stuff. We'll put all of that stuff in the show notes, guys, if you didn't catch that, so you can find all the links there. Thank you for anyone who's listened, and if anyone thinks this may be of interest to any of their friends, family, or anyone else, please pass it on. And as always, like, rate and subscribe. But until now, enjoy, stay safe, and have a walk in a park.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you.